this Ph.D. defense, and I'm Kirsten. I'm a professor in climate change and economics from the DTU Management Engineering. And I have a long checklist here on what I'm going to tell you. So I hope I remember everything important. And it is Yannick, Cornet, who today is going to defend his Ph.D. thesis on indicators and beyond, assessing the sustainability of transport projects. And he has delivered his Ph.D. thesis to this Ph.D. program committee at the DTU on construction, production, civil engineering, and transport. So this is quite a wide agenda on this committee. And we have a very distinguished doctoral committee here, headed by Per Nielsen from DTU Management. And we have Katie Macaris from Brie University, Brussels. I'm not able to pronounce this.
That's free is okay.
The Free University. And Greg Marston from the Institute for Transport Studies at Leeds University. And such a Ph.D. defense here has a very sort of formal procedure. So what is happening is that first, Yannick, he has 45 minutes exactly to make his presentation. And then we will make a short break of 5 to 10 minutes. And in that break, after that, the doctoral committee would ask questions and discuss with Yannick. People from the audience can also make questions after the committee. But if you want to do that, you have to tell me in the break immediately after the presentation by Yannick. So in total, the Ph.D. defense can take maximum 3 hours. So you know when you are allowed to leave here. But I think normally it would be shorter. And then, after the defense has finished here, then the audience will leave the room here and go out for the reception. And the doctoral committee will make a decision about whether they will approve the Ph.D. And they will come and join us at the reception outside here and tell us what the result is. So I hope I have remembered everything, so I just give the floor to Yannick.
45 minutes. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me. The thesis title is Indicators and Beyond, Assessing the Sustainability of Transport Projects. What if this was the vision? What if this is what the future looked like? This picture is from Luca Dacci, a researcher from Erasmus University. It represents a type of punctiform city which is dense with walking human settlements which are connected between each other with some kind of elevated high-speed rail. And the question is, maybe the question that I'm concerned in this thesis is this vision desirable? And if it's desirable, is it sustainable? Assuming that this is a desirable vision, how do we get there? How do we make sure that the steps that we take today, they take us to this vision? How do we make sure that the transport infrastructure and the land use that we decide in decision-making serve as stepping stones to this kind of vision? So this is really the motivating driver of this thesis, is the how do we make decisions towards this. Now, the second point I want to make is underlying everything I will talk today. There's quite a bit of quite a lot of it is normative. The goal is to systematize the task of assessing transport projects, but what is desirable for one person could be different from somebody else. So basically, well, I invite you to think about during this presentation what is then your desirable vision of the future. So let me just proceed. On the lecture plan is quite simple. I have a short introduction. I will present the key elements of my 5 articles and then present some conclusions and perspectives. Okay, introduction. Okay, one assumption for this, first of all, is really that our current transport system is unsustainable. I won't linger here. I think everyone can relate to this, what Givoni and Brun have called the hopeless fight against congestion. There's also issues of safety. This is not to show necessarily that flying is dangerous, but it's just to put in perspective that effectively 13 of these are the equivalent of the deaths on the transport system worldwide is about 13 of these crashing per day. Emissions is also a big problem, both in terms of air pollution, but also in terms of CO2 emission. This is from my own experience living in Beijing, which you've probably heard about. But then there's also issues of fragmentation, natural habitat fragmentation, but also human fragmentation in the sense of not being able to go from one point or the other because of transport infrastructure. There's the vicious cycle of development of transport and interaction with land use, which creates sprawl, which can then entrench further car dependency. The issue of health and noise from transport infrastructure, and finally the issue of equity, which we mentioned also this morning, but basically who are the winners and who are the losers of our current transport system. So these were the bad news. Now there's also some interesting trends that are ongoing that I want to quickly summarize. Transport, well, I'll just say first, during my PhD years, I think transport has become a really hot topic. We've seen a lot happening. On one hand, we've seen we have this idea of improving. There's three main strategies or 3 main trends, I would say. One is this decarbonization of transport, which comes back to this old dream of electrification and automation of automobiles. But aside from that, we also have this general shift, this general trend for diversification of transport. So that's basically moving to different modes that are less environmentally impactful. And here I have a picture of high-speed rail because I'm concerned with high-speed rail in this thesis quite a bit. And then a third overarching trend is this idea of what about avoiding the need for transport in the first place? And I call this trend for densification of cities, but it's also linked to greenification of cities and beautification of cities. And underlying all of this, we have the technology aspect of it, which is really creating, which I call the digitalization, which is creating a kind of virtuous circle of impact of improving these 3 trends. And we could, for example, we're close to it because we have the video cameras, but we could, for example, have had this defense remote. So, but this said, we still have some challenges, big challenges. So the main one is that little has been done in terms of taking a strong and explicit sustainability perspective in transport assessment. In other words, credibly demonstrating progress towards a genuinely more sustainable transport situation is a big challenge. The decisions we make are not yet fully aligned with sustainable transport principles. And so the proposal here is really that we need to fully integrate sustainability in all the conceptual, operational, and procedural approaches to decision making. And current decision support process and assessment tools are inadequate in that sense. So that's a kind of starting assumption. So the main research question, which is really the driver here, is how can sustainability be transformed from general ideals to corresponding decision support processes and assessment tools that genuinely support sustainable development in the transport sector. So it's a broad research question, but it has been the key driver. The key point basically is that we know what the solutions could be, but we have an implementation gap. How do we implement those great solutions? How do we speed up those trends that I presented earlier? So presentation of my articles, well, I have 5. The first one is really about it's taking a starting point in indicators and indicator frameworks. The idea here is that indicators are knowledge tools that are really at the core of sustainable transport appraisal, and they make a logical starting point in that sense. They're key operational information units. And so I first start by analyzing these indicator frameworks and looking at the state of the art. But then expanding from that, the second and the third articles, and I put them sort of together here because they look at how then do we operationalize sustainability and what I call a sustainability viewpoint in sustainable transport appraisal. And that looks at the wider picture of not just indicator frameworks, but decision support processes and assessment tools. Taking a little step even wider, I look within the scope of transport planning and decision making. I look at then in paper 4 at the trade-offs between biodiversity loss and climate in sustainable transport appraisal. And the final paper is really a conceptual piece on the concept of reasonable travel time, and I'll explain what that is. And the last little note saying that this is all part of transport governance. I don't make too much, I talk about policy making. I will talk a little bit about implications for politics. I don't talk about polity, which is basically the institutional side of how agencies are organized. So just to frame a little bit what I do here. Now, a key contribution that I'm also building on is that of David Bannister's sustainable mobility paradigm, which basically contrasts this conventional approach to transport planning with this sustainable mobility approach of transport planning. Essentially, it's about looking at accessibility instead of mobility, but there's a few more points to that. He suggests that the conventional approach looks at economic evaluation as a way of assessing transport, while this sustainable mobility approach would look at multi-criteria analysis to take account of the wider environmental and social concerns. And that's what I do in paper 2 and 3. The paper 4 is an analysis of a real case in the UK, so it basically looks at both and what the situation is, but the UK is very interesting because it has already both kind of approaches in its system. So it's kind of a state-of-the-art worthwhile looking at. And the last paper on travel time, on reasonable travel time, well, it's basically him, David Bannister, who came up with this idea of reasonable travel time. However, it remained undefined in that paper here, so that's the point of going further. And one more thing to say about these two approaches is, on one hand, we have the conventional approach where the focus is on motorized transport, and the sustainable mobility approach where there's this idea of all modes of transport in a hierarchy. And just to say that in this thesis, I actually just really focus in the middle of it, which is high-speed rail case for the last 3 articles. Okay, so the first article was published last year in Transportation Research Record. The title is Building a Meta Framework for Sustainable Transport Indicators, Review of Selected Contributions. The point is that measuring progress towards sustainable transport is really not trivial, and doing it randomly is not the solution. So it's quite complex. And so the purpose of the paper is to develop a meta framework for what should inform the analysis and the design of sustainable transport indicator frameworks. The key point here is, rather than trying to come up with a set of indicators that we could all use to measure sustainable transportation, is to come up with a set of criteria that would be able to judge the assessment frameworks themselves on their ability to somehow deliver sustainability. Just going back. Method is to take an explicit framework theory, and on that, the first part of it is really to of course, deconstruct this in some kind of way. And then we have these, then we produce these 3 functions. One is this idea that one set of criteria should look at the conceptualization. This is theory driven, so it's basically what is the theoretical basis for the indicator framework? How is sustainability defined in that framework? Is that actually done explicitly? And these kind of criteria. The second part is maybe what has traditionally received more focus is the operationalization. How do we actually select indicators? How do we decide what is a quality indicator or not? What is the overall internal logic to it? And the final part is what I call the utilization. We could find other words, I guess, but it's really how does that actually work out in practice in the context of governance and of planning, and looking at actually whether, for example, whether indicators influence the decisions or not, and how. And the results, well, we don't need to go through the whole list here, but it's just so you kind of see what came out of that, was basically to look at the key literature on sustainable transportation indicator frameworks. And a lot of these papers came out with a lot of kind of learnings of their own. And, well, basically I collected them all in a kind of difficult and long iterative process also with co-writers. Findings and research paths. So the main part here is well, the three functions of really looking at conceptualization, operationalization, and utilization provide a useful first level structure to assess assessment tools. In other words, the learnings from looking at these indicator frameworks seem to be relevant to use also to look at the wider picture of assessment tools and decision support processes. So the next step is really to develop, well, there's many next steps that could be done. We could also analyze existing frameworks using that in a kind of consulting matter, but one way is to also develop each meta-criterion, look at how could they actually be, what do they mean in more detail, and look beyond the indicators, which is what I do. And here I try to summarize a little bit. Then the next paper is where all of the next papers kind of look at sustainability from an explicit and holistic view, which is one of the conceptual criteria. But then we have the next article, which I'll present now, which looks at how to provide guidance on ranking sustainability effects, which is also a conceptual criteria. The third article really looks at in more detail on how to provide an explicit process for doing that, and how at the same time to engage with stakeholders and the context. So now I'm starting to span across. I haven't looked at all of them, obviously, but, and the last one, article number 4 looks at the trade-offs between, in this case, climate and biodiversity. And article number 5 about reasonable travel time is really about providing guidance for the field of sustainable transport and how to make choices within that. Okay, article 2. This one was also published last year in a special issue in Transport. But here I need to take a little step back here to explain, first of all, what do I mean by decision support processes and, and assessment tools in STA. The way I see it is that we have, first of all, this kind of first generation set of tools, cost-benefit analysis, which we saw this morning, which is mostly based on these objectivist, positivist assumptions. It's a well-established tool for transport appraisal. The key is that it uses a common unit, which is money, which makes things very easy to compare. And in a way, it's a way to civilize decision-making. Otherwise, it would be left to
perhaps random judgments. Then the second generation, which is multi-criteria analysis, and it's in a way it's an extension of this instrumental rationality, and it's also what Otto was talking about this morning is then how to then is a tool that is proposed to assess those impacts that cannot easily be monetizable. Not everything that counts can be counted, and MCA can do that to some extent, right? And then the third generation is MAMCA, multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis. But the key point here is that we're sort of shifting rationality towards a more communicative rationality where suddenly stakeholders' perspectives matter. And the key here, we try to make those a bit more explicit. One key underlying assumption to this rationality is that it's a complex problem. There's probably no right answer. So that's the idea of providing different perspectives. And the key additional to this third generation tool is to add a future generation stakeholder perspective. And then what I investigate is how do we create that future generation's perspective? Obviously, we cannot really ask them. And this article is really the first step, so is to develop a method to integrate strong principles of sustainability as a means to inform the weighting of transport effects. The method is, first I spent quite a bit of time reviewing the literature on sustainability principles. Then we applied multi-criteria analysis to the Frederikssunds Bridge case, which they're actually building. And then operationalize sustainability by using the nested model of sustainability. And here it's important to say a few words about that. The nested model of, this is let's say the usual way of framing sustainability with the 3-dimension, and the nested model puts the environment on the outside with this assumption that sustaining the integrity of the ecological systems is a precondition for having human systems, society in the first place, and having a kind of social system, a working social system is also a prerequisite for having a thriving economy. So it has a normative idea here, huh? That it sets already some kind of priority on what matters more and what not. And I will quickly explain, there's many ways to sort of justify this nested model, and it's important to do it a little bit because I use that to operationalize the future generations perspective. But I can't help going back to Brundtland. If we look carefully at her report, she's very clear that the needs of the poor have overriding priority. No doubt about that. And here we can see that up to a certain extent, the environmental impacts, and this is the Kuznets curves, as countries get richer, their immediate environmental impacts reduce. But what she's very clear also when we look at richer countries is what I call this paradox of affluence, is that as increasing human wants are met, it's also increasingly long-term environmental impacts, and she turns to saying in that context, the first priority is to sustain this ecological integrity, which basically resonates well with this nested model, which puts the environmental dimension first. And Brundtland would then suggest that instead of going into increasing more wants, and that we should do so in a way that does not increase our environmental impact, basically. So it's very rough, but that's kind of the idea behind. I could use other ways, like planetary boundaries concepts or natural step principles, to also lead to the same conclusion. But I need to finish on this. So how do we operationalize the virtual future generations perspective? Is quite simple then. Again, there's probably different ways of doing it, but I use surrogate weights based on statistics, and basically it says that if you have a priority list of 3 elements, you should give them these weights. And so we apply 52% weight to environmental aspects, 32% to social, and 15% to economic as a kind of a operationalization of sustainability. And the result in this bridge case is, well, the kind of table that we get with the list of criteria that were relevant for this specific case. And I don't need to explain in detail what that was, but the point was that we have a view from the municipality, and then this kind of green meritocracy view from this computed way. And we can see the municipality viewpoint obviously wants the alternative one, which is the one that was built, which is a new bridge over a Natura 2000 protected area. But if we apply this weighing on the different criteria, then we can see that alternatives that don't imply building a new bridge, but that instead suggested to build a light rail or a dedicated shuttle bus service would be, at least theoretically, from future generations' perspective, more preferable. Another way could be to apply those weights before on each single criteria, but we can maybe talk about that in more detail. So, Article 3 continues on this. In Article 3, the point is to develop a STA process. Again, make explicit the sustainability viewpoint, explore the trade-offs in terms of methodology, and here I use the high-speed rail case in the UK. We adapt the multi-actor, multi-criteria analysis, and the two key elements of it is really the developing a comprehensive list of impacts of assessment criteria, and then the other key point was to use structured interviews. I mean, there's many ways of involving stakeholders here, and I'll explain that a bit more. High-speed rail 2, very quickly, it's a very expensive, very fast train plan, high-speed rail line planned between London and the West Midlands, and there's two phases that are planned to start construction basically next year and will open for the first phase in 2026 and second phase in 2033. And in this assessment, what I do is I take the two other alternatives that were considered early in the process. There's many more, but these were considered a bit more seriously, let's say. One is a high-speed rail along an existing transport corridor along the M1 highway, which has the advantage of not going through this kind of protected area of outstanding natural beauty here. But another alternative is actually not to build any kind of high-speed rail at all and upgrade the existing West Coast Main Line in red there. And all of these three options have different characteristics, different prices, different speeds. And then we went on to develop 28 criteria based mostly on the official guidance from the UK called WebTag, but also through an iterative and interactive process with respondents. And this is also actually showing, well, actually it's not showing very much, but there should be some buttons, and that's part of the survey or the online survey that we did to run this. So by structured interview, I mean that I was interviewing the respondents, but going through this survey with them. It looked like this. This is for prioritizing then the criteria from their perspective. They really like the sliders. And this is a standard way of computing weights. This is to assess the performance. There's quite a bit of details behind this, but I can probably explain. One important aspect is we looked quite carefully at the common biases. MCA is basically based on judgments from the stakeholders or the experts in this case. And so we looked at these different biases, like motivational bias, for example. If someone really wants one option, he might be tempted to assess his preferred option unfairly, let's say. So type of result that I have is, well, here is really all the results. So basically we have the 28 criteria that are assessed, but it's a relative assessment. It's not an absolute assessment. So basically they're all assessed compared to each other. And what this shows is that the preferred option of high-speed rail 2, in terms of the goals that were official for HS2, perform very well. We can see the blue is HS2, and we can see that HS2 performs quite well on all these. Well, for example, this idea of rail capacity for passengers and journey time and economic development. But if we just single out the environmental impacts, we can see that HS2 perform much less well. And this is already telling us that, okay, so if we have different opinion on what matters, probably the preferred solution will differ. This is what the final result looked like, but it's probably easier to view it like this, because the other one includes some robustness analysis and sensitivity tests. But basically what we can see, in this case, we interviewed all transport experts. So there's no politicians in this, but some people were transport experts in government, then other transport professionals, so academics and those working in the industry. And we singled those out from transport experts in NGOs, and then we came up with a kind of way of defining who then would qualify as sustainable transport researchers. And we can see that the government is a bit ambivalent. As long as we're building high-speed rail, it's fine. Probably the politicians want high-speed rail too as it is, but that was just interesting. The transport professionals were quite keen on the alignment along the highway. But the sustainable transport researchers, the NGOs, were not keen, well, much less keen. We're more keen on actually upgrading the existing infrastructure. And then if we apply, so this we could say is a kind of bottom-up sustainability perspective, while here we have our theoretical perspective, where we apply those weights that I explained in the previous paper, and we can see that it's even a bit stronger than the upgrade performs much better. And then we can look at why that is, and very quickly we can see that government and other transport professionals, their priorities are roughly economic development, passenger capacity, time, freight capacity. But NGOs and sustainable transport researchers, well, sustainable transport researchers think accessibility is very important, connectivity, and NGOs suddenly have put much importance to land use and landscape, which is normal because they were mostly local NGOs along the line representing those interests. So, key takeaways. Well, there's quite a few, but expert and stakeholder judgment, which is the basis for MCA, requires knowledge about the project and its options. It's important to cover all the impacts to avoid the omission bias. Semi-structured interviews work quite well, actually, for validating the quality of the input, but also in terms of self-learning, reflexive process with those interviewed. And then the idea here is MAMCA enables this type of communicative rationality. It provides clarity about the competing views and why, and the sensitivity analysis is a way, I think, to support then negotiation of the different projects. Okay, and very quickly through Article 4 now, which is maybe, those two last articles are maybe a bit more fun, a bit more less nitty-gritty details. No, this one looks at the trade-offs associated with HS2. And the idea is to look at HS2 because it's the UK is kind of state-of-the-art appraisal system. So if we look at how the two core planetary boundaries of climate change and biosphere integrity, how have they actually been assessed? If it's not done well in the UK, there's little chance that it's done really well anywhere else. That's kind of the idea here. Again, we have the HS2 alignment. The key point is that, well, the original tunneling was going to go through this forest and build this kind of how do you call that now? It's not a trench, I forgot. A cutting, of course. And then eventually, after quite a few years of petitioning and consultation, they approved building of a tunnel under these, and this is old growth forest, which from sustainability perspective is irreplaceable capital. But the key point is that, and that's interesting, is that if we want to increase the level of biodiversity and build more tunnels, then we end up having more carbon because the carbon footprint of building tunnels is much more intense. I have some numbers that explain that, but the key point is really that building this extra tunnel is 60,000 tons of CO2. The forest we save, strictly speaking, is about 15,000 tons. And then that forest can save another 5,000 tons over 50 years. So basically, if we were to offset the construction, to justify the construction of the tunnel by saving the forest for the sequestration of CO2, we would have to wait 800 years for that to happen. This is just to illustrate basically that there's an issue of time with carbon emissions, biodiversity. They claim that HS2 is carbon neutral, but actually is it carbon neutral? Because it has a huge upfront cost of building the thing, especially in terms of tunnel and concrete. while the benefits that are claimed from carbon sequestration from forest planting, but also from mode shift, will only start accruing once the thing is built. So, there's quite a lot of lessons learned looking at this case, but generally speaking, that this issue of trade-off and time was not really well accounted for or well understood. Also that the environmentalists were split, the local and the national. I mean, high-speed rail seems environmentally friendly, that's what we think, right? So, but the local ones are against it because it's going through natural areas. But overall, the environment is seen as a secondary problem, as it gets a subsidiary role. And in that case, well, the debate here was at some point driven more by politics than the result of assessment tools. So to some extent, those assessment tools were discredited during the process, which means it's good because it means more democratic participation, but did they actually have a chance to influence the result? It's a complex case. Point is, speed and cost really have taken priority there. And speed is interesting because that takes us to Article 5. The purpose here is really to enrich or somewhat challenge the current planning paradigm based on saving travel time, contributing to a better understanding of the value of travel time, and then introducing reasonable travel time. So the purpose is not to define how to measure reasonable travel time. So what we do is we deconstruct the elements that compose travel time and develop a more holistic kind of conceptualization. So what is reasonable travel time? Well, it's a function, first of all, of the activities at destination. Obviously, our perception of travel time depends on why we're going somewhere and how long we plan to be there and at what time we need to be there, if it's critical or not. And if the travel time is too high, we might not go, or we might add more purposes at destination. But the door, then it's also a function of door-to-door travel time, and high-speed rail is really interesting here. I interviewed some people who lived in Coventry, and they said, well, this high-speed rail line is really means that I will have to drive further to go to a station to actually gain time to go faster. To basically, from a traveler's perspective, what really matters is door-to-door. Now, from a car perspective, we think of it as door-to-door, but with high-speed rail or other transport modes, it's more multimodal and more complicated than that. Now, we usually focus on improving one segment of the travel, and the final part is this idea of travel experience. Now, in a technology-enabled age, and that's me taking a train somewhere to a conference in the US from Montreal, you can actually spend your time traveling for something useful, which is not necessarily the case with other transport mode. If you're cycling or driving a car, it's a bit more difficult to use the time for something. So basically, the point of this article is, if we want to invest in transport, so let's say we have this kind of balance between the whole door-to-door travel time and the travel experience, and we want to improve reasonable travel time, we could decide to improve the main trunk line, like we might do by building a new high-speed rail line, but we could also decide to improve the connectivity, or we could decide to improve the travel experience by providing more seating, for example, or Wi-Fi. Key point is basically that investing in experience or interconnectivity and not speed is likely, at least in some contexts, to be more efficient investment. So, conclusions and perspectives. It's hard to make hard conclusions. It's more perspectives really, but sustainability is really holistic. Incorporating sustainability in transport assessment requires broadening the scope, and here basically means looking at operational, but not only operational aspects, but conceptual and utilization aspects. And these considerations are not always explicitly addressed, even in the state-of-the-art appraisal process. From conceptualization, strong sustainability theory can provide useful top-down guidance. It's not like we don't know what sustainability is about, and that can be used to prioritize impacts in assessment. In terms of operationalization, the MCA multi-criteria analysis methods can be well adapted to provide such strong sustainability viewpoint. One point here is to reprioritize the impacts from a future generations perspective, and the key point is really to make this perspective visible in decision making. So make this viewpoint visible. And again, this can be done then in two ways. It can be done top-down using theory, using rank order distribution to reorder the impacts in a way that is more aligned with the goals of sustainable development, or it can be done using the bottom-up approach involving experts, stakeholders in taking putting themselves in the shoes of future generations, and which is basically Rawls' veil of ignorance from his theory of justice. And finally, on the utilization part, well, important to say that the results here are not intended to be used as is. Again, the point is really to compare the different stakeholder perspective in a communicative process and to open for then negotiation. But there's also a problem that actually, even if we did all of this and we did it all well, would it actually change anything? Would it influence decisions? That, I think, is still a kind of open question, which I would be very keen to work more on. Another thing I would like to say as a conclusion is then how to if we were to formalize sustainable transport appraisal, and this has been the topic for the day. But I would like to say these things. So I see there's some essential characteristics. First of all, that, well, I've mentioned it a few times now, but that the analysis and design of STA process should involve explicitly addressing conceptual, operational, and utilization challenges. On the conceptual side, STA is based on first-order principles of sustainability, and sustainability here is an explicit normative goal. Operational is the core process of sustainable transport appraisal is decision making, meaning that decision is not the end result. It's a process that is done that is slowly funneling itself to actually building something. And in terms of utilization, STA is democratic, it's political, it makes the perspective of stakeholders explicit in the decision-making process, but importantly, we extend this democratic incorporation, this idea of more democracy, to including future generations in our assessment. So it's just being more democratic, really, but in a virtual way. And I add also that from a philosophy of science perspective, STA is plural. It's really a combination of various rationalities. I haven't really fully internalized that, but it's the idea of bridging participatory debate, so this is social constructionism, with the multiplicity of alternatives, the idea that there's no single best option, so that's more relativism, and still keeping this idea of deterministic laws about nature and sustainability, which is more positivism. So, final slide on perspectives. We're doomed, but let's try to do something anyway about it. No, there's no silver bullet. Sustainable transport is wicked. A lot of it, okay, this is my assessment, a lot of it boils down to lack of integrated network planning. We really need for true option generation. But the interesting thing is that multi-criteria analysis embeds this idea of having true options from the beginning much more clearly. And then for us engineers, I really see it as an opportunity that we become providers of tools and methods and systems to support the formulation, implementation, and enforcement of policies.
the way to summarize it is basically instead of looking at engineering from a really strictly problem-solving way, it can become something more normative and problem-framing role in the development of these tools. And finally, I would say, let's keep it complex. Knowledge is uncertain. Okay, well that's it. Thank you really very much for your attention. And I think it was in time.